picking up with Dr. Don Terryville, who's director of the Center for Governmental Services at Auburn University. And as we were concluding the first module, Don, you were talking about going to South Africa, with an entrepreneurship conference, and really delving into some of the issues of small businesses there. But what your aha moment wasn't necessarily in South Africa, but it was when you got back to the United States to determine and to see that there were some issues here on this side of the Atlantic that we're thinking that we're going to South Africa and we have some of the answers, but in reality, when we come back, some of the same problems that you're noticing from a financial standpoint of view as it related to the issue of transparency, it's right here.
Absolutely.
Pick up on that and walk us through that again.
Oh, yes. Again, we were at the point of, as you conveyed, going to South Africa, identifying various things that were interesting, we thought, for them, because we were encouraging initiative.
Mm-hmm.
We were encouraging the fact that if an individual is in South Africa, the person may have lived in the townships, right? And we know the townships were challenged areas, but the person may not have had a lot to start off with. So the model that we were recommending was, how can we get that individual to start where they were? In the United States, at that time, outside of the rural communities, we weren't really talking that as much.
And by the way, when you say time, for the viewer, we're talking about 2003.
2003,
Yeah.
exactly. We basically, when we talked about small business, doing around 2003, 2004 area, we often thought about minority business enterprises, if you will, or the minority business component on a national level, with the Department of
Minority Business Development Agency, Commerce.
That's correct, on the Department of Commerce. But after the fiscal meltdown occurred, we then began hearing mainstream academics begin talking about the value of initiative and the value of starting where you are. If you are a stay-at-home mom, start where you are.
Stay at home.
If you are a person who is in need of a job, well, you may have to begin thinking differently about entrepreneurship. Start where you are. Now, that kind of conversation wasn't a part of the mainstream conversation in 2004. So as we looked at some of the things that we discussed in South Africa, and as you know, Keenan, you and I published a book together called South Africa and the United States, or Entrepreneurship in South Africa and the United States. Comparative kind of studies.
Right.
And so as I looked at that book for South Africa, some of the recommendations that were there, they became very, very necessary points for us to talk about after the financial meltdown in the United States. I also participated in a conference in London with the Center on Parliamentary Studies, and they were very interested in that conversation as well, because prior to the meltdown, that conversation was for those smaller countries, those poorer countries, and we later found that they became very valuable for everybody. Randall Robinson years ago made a comment that if you don't do what you can, sooner or later, what's happening in foreign lands will be on your street.
And by the way, for the person that's watching this module, share with them who Randall Robinson is, because they might not be aware of Randall Robinson.
Randall Robinson, years ago, was the executive director of TransAfrica. And Randall Robinson had the bird's eye view on South Africa particularly. And TransAfrica was instrumental in the change of apartheid in South Africa. So he was an amazing personality at the time. And so we're basically saying that as it relates to this conversation of entrepreneurship, it is important not only that we learn about it from the point of view of the United States, but it's important that we learn about it from the point of view of China, various countries in Latin America, smaller countries in Africa, because they may have an angle on how to think about the energy that goes into the development of business that we may not be thinking about.
Well, since you mentioned that, then from a comparative perspective, who would you say on the global landscape is doing some of the things that you would want to see done in the area of transparency and finance on the private side?
I think that the conversation of transparency is becoming a lot more mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever we hear about the importance of government getting more involved in business, the business community, of course, people don't want the conversation of regulations, but most want to think about the value of deregulation. But in the end of the day, more transparency could translate for some into more regulations, and individuals may not like that. But I think that if you just point in one direction or another direction around the globe, we can learn from so many groups. I think what we find taking place in Africa is very, very interesting in my thinking when it comes down to the business community, the business cycles period. We know today that China is invested in Africa in a major way, and we've often been recommending that kind of investment from the U.S. In Africa starts to take place a little bit more. I think China is planting seeds there. They're planting seeds that will eventually blossom into great opportunities. We know that in Nigeria, for example, it's viewed as having one of the fastest growing economy around the world, and we know that various countries and various locations in India where we find the same thing. I'm pointing to these developing countries, Kenya, Africa, and some of the countries in Africa and Asia, and of course I'm zeroing in on India because in some of those places there's a creative spirit that's there, and that spirit is one that we find that's viewed as a spirit that's necessary for entrepreneurship.
So what I'm actually hearing from you is that what we have coined as third world or developing, they're actually coming up with the best. They're coming up with now the emerging models in terms of best practices as it relates to transparency and finance, whether it's on the public or the private side. Interesting, because we have been so socialized to think that we're God's gift to the rest of global humanity, when in fact there are some lessons that we could be learning from some other people around the world.
Right. I would like to part just a little bit in saying that as it relates to the issue of transparency in the countries like Africa, many of the countries in Africa, and perhaps other countries within the developing world as well. Some of those countries are still a bit more challenged with transparency.
Understood.
Actually, we have been recommending for them to be more transparent because we think transparency leads to investment. Most banks and financial institutions are more likely to invest when they can predict what's taking place and they know that there are practices in place that make sense. Some of those,
I love that.
Some of those smaller businesses in those countries are still developing practices. However, the initiative to do and to develop and to build are actually in those areas. We can be of greater assistance, that is, by helping those communities in some of these countries to develop practices that are consistent with the modern world, if you will. I don't think that many of them would be opposed to it. I just think that the educational component is still necessary to get over that.
Speaking of education, where can small businesses go to get help and information with building a culture of transparency, financial transparency?
Mm-hmm. I think that IC Square Institute has within its at the University of Texas at Austin, IC Square at the University of Texas at Austin, has within its capability that type of skill set, that type of understanding. Auburn University has that type of skill set as well. We work very closely with the College of Business at Auburn, and if individuals are interested in that type of having a better understanding in that community, in that area, we can be of some assistance as well.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Beal.
Yes.
And we'll sign off now.